Welcome to Fireside Gaming. I'm Billum, and this week we're suiting up for some hardcore mecha action with a look at Armored Core for the PlayStation. Armored Core is a series I have a lot of fondness for, as I spent plenty of time playing it with friends back in high school. At the time, we played several of the games that came out on the PlayStation 2. In fact, before this review, I'd only ever played Armored Core games on that console. That shouldn't come as much of a surprise though. Of the 15 mainline Armored Core games, 8 of them came out on the PS2. Yeah, this series really reached its peak at that time. I mostly spent my time playing Armored Core 2, but I also had fun with several other games that came out on the console. Originally, I wasn't too interested in moving backwards to play earlier games in the series. For one, the PS1 Armored Core games are hard to find, as well as expensive. And for another, I was worried that the games wouldn't be as good as the PS2 releases. However, with my waning lack of interest in modern games comes a desire to expand my retro game collection. That's when I decided I should go ahead and give the earlier games a shot. After all, I don't believe in buying a game unless it's to be played. With that brief history out of the way, let's discuss what Armored Core is, which will include spoilers by the way. This game, as well as the series in general, has players creating their own mechs that share the game's title. The players use these mechs to complete missions, which earn them money and sometimes additional parts. The biggest draw of Armored Core is this customization. Players can choose between several components when creating their mechs. Of course, that includes the basics, such as the head, the body, the arms, and the legs. However, there's also a hefty amount of weapon and attachment configurations to consider. You've got laser swords for close combat, ranged weapons such as shotguns, machine guns, and sniper rifles, as well as back-mounted weapons to consider. Then there's the finer details, such as the targeting system, radar, engine, and booster. Players will also have to weigh out these parts when considering optional equipment that can provide other special effects. That's a lot to take in, and players don't get hit with all of this right out of the gate. Instead, they start out with a pretty basic AC without much in the way of power to rely on. To fix this, the player operates as a Raven, a mercenary for hire that completes missions with their mecha. Doing these missions offers considerable pay that the player can use to buy new parts and weapons for their AC. However, they don't just get to pocket all of that money. There's operating costs to consider. Before a Raven ever gets to see those funds added to their wallet, they need to pay for the repairs to their mech as well as cover the cost of ammo. This is an aspect of Armored Core that I absolutely love. It really drives home that feeling of a mercenary out on their own trying to make ends meet. It's not uncommon at all to have to weigh cost into actions during a mission. A perfect example of this is missiles. Sure, they do a lot of damage, but they're costly to use. That opens the player up to an internal conflict. Do they spend that extra money to take out enemies, or try to save their missiles and conserve cost? Then you have to consider the damage you're taking as well. Will it really be cheaper to draw out the mission to avoid the cost of using missiles, or will it be cheaper to use them and avoid that extra damage? This thought process also leads to the player making cost decisions when upgrading their Armored Core. In my case, I saved up for a powerful engine early on so I could make the switch to energy weapons. Doing so allowed me to reduce my ammo cost as energy weapons don't need replenished after missions. However, that doesn't mean it didn't cause other problems for me. I had to be careful about using my booster in battles because of this. Doing so could overheat my engine, and when that happens, I'd have to wait a considerable amount of time for it to cool down. Because of that, I can't make use of the booster or the energy weapons until it's done. Keeping this in mind, I ended up upgrading my booster for a more efficient one. That, plus the lightweight of my mecha allowed me to make it through a fair portion of the game without energy worries. Unfortunately, that strategy didn't work out as well for me late game. I ended up running into trouble with tougher opponents due to my low armor points, which are health in this game. To combat this, I built one chonky boy and also upgraded to an even more efficient and powerful booster. Of course, that still meant I had to be careful about boosting too much due to my heavy weight. So I avoided that to the best of my ability with a shoulder-mounted laser cannon. Now I could enter a kneeling position to fire that shoulder laser for massive damage and avoid using boost too often. This was basically my setup I used for the endgame of Armored Core, though I did have to make some changes for a couple of missions. The first of these is this dumb corrosive gas mission. It requires players to run through an underground base planting mines while their health is constantly being drained from the gas. I did a lot of save scumming to make it through this mission and had to go in with little equipment to increase my speed enough for it. Even then, I barely made it out alive, and I never want to do it again. The second mission that gave me a lot of trouble was the final one, but I don't want to dive into it too far without talking about the story of Armored Core. So let's switch gears for just a second. Armored Core takes place in a future setting where humanity has fled underground. That's the result of the Great Destruction, an event taking place at the end of a 30-year war. The effects of this have made the surface of the world uninhabitable. About 50 years after this is where the story picks up. Players take on the role of a Raven seeking out missions from anyone that will pay. Two of the biggest contractors are Chrome and Murakumo Millennium. These are warring corporations that often hire the Raven to sabotage each other. Due to this, players can actually cause a branching storyline depending on what missions they take. Those missions will also sometimes affect future missions available to them. A perfect example of this comes from one mission I took for Murakumo to release bioweapons being developed by Chemical Dyne, which is funded by Chrome. After doing so, I was offered a mission from Chemical Dyne to exterminate the very bioweapons that I had released from my previous attack. Yet again, I love this kind of stuff. Not only does it open the way for multiple playthroughs, but it really does hammer home that mercenary mentality of doing anything so long as the pay is good. These missions will continue to get more and more extreme until eventually one of the corporations loses out to the other, which is a direct effect of the player's actions. At the same time, players will also see their rank rise. See, Ravens keep track of the best among them with a ranking system. You start at the bottom, but rise higher as you complete missions. This sometimes has you facing off against the other Ravens on the list during your missions. This comes to a conclusion with the final mission of the game: Destroy Floating Mines. The mission is actually a trap set up in the main Raven base, called Raven's Nest. This pits the player against Hustler 1 and their 9-ball Armored Core. This mission sucks hard. While there's no denying that 9-ball is tough to defeat, there's another major problem with it: platforming. There's an incredibly long section of climbing, floating, and moving blocks that players have to complete before they ever make their way to battle against Hustler 1. Of course, when players do finally make it up to the 9-ball battle, they're low on health from getting attacked by turrets and other mecha during their climb. Also, Hustler 1 is no pushover either. They can easily kill the player with their insane damage output. And to top it off, there's a second 9-ball the player has to beat. This is where we get our major twist for the game. Hustler 1 isn't actually a person. It's just an AI operating the 9-ball ACs. After beating both the 9-balls, players reach this AI. We learn that it's the master of Raven headquarters and has been orchestrating the battle between Chrome and Murakumo. It sought to kill the player as they'd become too powerful, making them a threat to its plans. With this knowledge in hand, we kill the AI, bringing an end to its scheming. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean peace is on the way. The game closes out with us learning that a new company is gearing up to challenge the survivor of the battles between Chrome and Murakumo, and that means more work for the Ravens. Now let's tackle the most controversial aspect of Armored Core: the controls. There's no denying that Armored Core has a bit of a learning curve to it, and that's largely due to the controls. See, the game came out in July 1997, which was prior to the release of the DualShock controller in November of that year. So players didn't have the option of using analog sticks. Unless you want to count the dual analog controller that came out in April 1997, but even then, that was already late into the game's development and many players were still sticking to their original PS1 controllers. So with that in mind, From Software came up with a somewhat different control scheme than what players might be used to. Some of the basics aren't too hard to understand. That includes the directional pad controlling mecha movement, and the face buttons performing jump, shoot, weapon switch, and melee attack. Even the shoulder buttons don't start off with anything crazy. L1 and R1 allow the player to strafe left and right, which is a key component to mastering the combat of Armored Core, but nothing too difficult to get the hang of. Instead, it's the R2 and L2 buttons that cause problems for new players. These control the ability to look up and down, which also affects aiming. It's not something that comes natural per se, and I can understand why some players would have a hard time adjusting to it. Even so, I promise you, it's worth learning the controls for this game. While the controls are complex, nothing feels better than mastering them. Boosting forward while dodging enemy fire to slash them with your energy blade is one of the most satisfying maneuvers in a game. And Armored Core is filled with moments like these as players come to understand the controls as well as the abilities and limitations of their AC. I know it probably sounds silly, but that extra level of skill that players have to obtain to experience Armored Core does make it more enjoyable. It adds to that feeling of being a mecha pilot and having to adapt to controls that the average person wouldn't understand. even if only a little. Also, if you happen to be like me and started with one of the PS2 Armored Core games, don't worry about the early games being too clunky. I was amazed whenever I picked up this game and my muscle memory immediately came back to me. It's very similar in control style to those later games. Let's close this out with a quick look at the visuals and music in Armored Core. The main draw of the game is obviously the mecha, and I'm happy to say they look awesome. Sure, the PS1 is a bit blocky by today's standards, but it doesn't hamper the experience. Plus, the iconic look of the mecha is great, and that comes as no surprise with Shoji Kawamori serving as the designer for the game. For those unaware, he's responsible for the mecha that appear in Macross, some of you might know it as Robotech over here in the States, as well as some of the classic Transformers. If there's one complaint about the graphics in Armored Core that I do have to voice, it's that it suffers from PS1 fog and draw distances. That's not too surprising, and luckily the game gets around it easily enough with plenty of indoor areas and a radar function to track enemies you can't see. But I do have to mention it. As for the soundtrack of Armored Core, it's a real treat with its industrial, techno, and synthwave tunes. There's a lot of crunch to the soundtrack that really fits its dark future setting. If you're into that kind of music, I highly advise checking it out even if you don't play the game. Overall, Armored Core holds up incredibly well. I'd go so far to call it one of the best games on the PS1, and will even place it among my top 10 games for the console. After playing the first Armored Core, I'm not shocked that it spawned From Software's biggest series. Sure, it hasn't had a new game since 2013, and everyone thinks of Dark Souls when they hear From Software now, but there's no denying that mecha was a major part of the company's history. While I'd love to see From Software return to the Armored Core series, I understand that they have their hands full with the Soulsborne series right now. It's one I deeply enjoy as well, and I'm looking forward to Elden Ring. Plus, there are so many Armored Core games that I have yet to play that I've got plenty of games to tide me over until the eventual return of the series. Thanks for sticking around with me while I nerd out about mecha, and I hope you enjoyed this look back at Armored Core. If so, I'd appreciate it if you'd like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, take it easy.